I really don't think hypocrisy is the problem.
And
I kind of wish it were. Because if you think about the classic cliche, hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue, which is to say, well, this is the way that we ought to behave with character and integrity, so let's pretend like we are. That's not what's happening right now. I mean, it is to some degree, but it always has.
It's worse than that.
It's a lot worse than that, which is a sense of there's such a lowered expectation that there is, in many cases, a valorizing of cruelty and power for the sake of power, and even sexual predation.
Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast. I hope this next episode helps you thrive in life and leadership. And if you enjoy it, hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. That way you'll never miss a thing. Pastors, I know how hard it can be to keep your sermons feeling fresh and relevant, and especially you're preaching week after week. So maybe you hit a writer's block, or it's Friday and you haven't really finished things up. I want to help. So I've got a 10-step preaching cheat sheet. After decades of preaching, I simplified the whole prep process into a series of steps and reminders that can help you ensure your sermons are engaging, relevant, and memorable. Super easy to use, 10 simple prompts with examples, and you can start using it as early as this Sunday. So visit preachingcheatsheet.com or click the link in the description and you'll get a copy sent to you for free today. This episode is also presented by 10 by 10. Did you know that approximately 1 million young people in America drift from their faith every year? And this means that by 2034, 10 million young people will walk away from their faith and miss out on experiencing the abundant life that Jesus promised. Well, imagine if we could do something to reverse this. That's why 10 by 10 was born. A national initiative created to help make faith matter more to 10 million young people over the next 10 years. Together, we can turn the tide of young people walking away from their faith. So the question is, will you answer the call to help 10 by 10 advocate for the faith of the next generation? You can go to 1010.org to learn more. That's 1010.org to learn more. And now to today's episode. Russell, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Good to be with you.
So you were raised in a pretty classic, strict conservative upbringing. Is that fair to say?
Well, of course, everything's relative.
Okay.
And I would say yes by most people's definition. But I knew people who were in much, much stricter sorts of religious backgrounds at the time, and we were considered to be kind of loose and freewheeling to them. So I guess
you were the apostate liberals, were you?
Yeah, because we watched television and things like that. Yeah.
So I don't think we've had 600 episodes in. I don't think we've had this conversation before. Well, you and I haven't. It's your first time on the podcast. I don't think we've had this conversation. What was like crazy strict in your childhood? You look back and some friends you knew or people you knew. What was like the strict end of the strict spectrum?
Well, I had a lot of friends who could not watch television. The girls had to wear skirts all the time. There was a really harsh sort of pastoring and parenting that would call people out from the pulpit and really a strict kind of authoritarian sort of parenting, which we didn't have. And I had people who were shocked at some of the things that we would watch that weren't risque. But
like what, Bugs Bunny, or like what are we talking about?
Well, things that had magic in them, you know.
Oh, okay.
That sort of thing. So yeah.
Okay, so that was hyper strict, but like it was Barack Obama's White House where you had your first alcohol. Is that right?
Yeah. The bless her heart, the lady who was giving it, they had a naughty section and a nice section. She called it, and she accidentally gave me the naughty, and so that was
okay.
So
more about your upbringing, because I hear this story all the time. I'm actually rather surprised that we haven't had that conversation more often. I mean, I guess Philip Yancey a little bit talked about his upbringing, but it was more about the abuse than anything. But I'm reading Tara Westover's Educated, that kind of thing. It's just crazy what some kids go through. So what were some of the good parts of that super strict upbringing? Because I think a lot of people can probably relate to that, or at least a meaningful number. And then what were some of what wasn't great about your upbringing, looking back on it?
It was mostly good. And again, I didn't see it as super strict, largely because my parents were not super strict. My parents were authoritative, but not authoritarian in terms of parenting. So I never felt squashed by them at all, the way that some people do. And our church, it was largely a very good experience. It was a close-knit community of people. Sometimes I think, they didn't really know how to do children's ministry, so they did the only thing they knew how to do, which was just to teach us the Bible. And I'm really glad. I mean, I was immersed in the Bible from the very beginning. So I have mostly very positive memories and responses to that home church.
But, we'll fast forward to a few years ago, and you're a relatively faithful, leading church member, and you find yourself with the tribe you grew up with on trial for heresy. What happened?
Yeah, well, I say heresy tongue-in-cheek. They didn't call it that. But it was a series of, some people have heresy trials, some people have inquisitions. We had task forces,
So you were task forced.
Committees, really bureaucratic sounding things. But yeah, I found myself in a situation where the context was there was an ever narrowing within our tradition. And there was almost a who's the next liberal? And so that kind of narrowing, which some people had warned me about years before, and I didn't believe it. I thought, no, it's just standing up for basic convictions, biblical conviction. But that was true. And so there was always a narrowing to the point that I would think, how am I here? I'm a very conservative, evangelical, homeschooling dad of 5. How are we having these conversations? And so, it was kind of like, it's kind of like what's going on in a lot of institutions in American life, and not just religious institutions. You have the institutions in crisis and declining, and that leads to a situation where, for lack of a better word, the normies, the grown-ups who normally would have run things, pull back, and you have some people who have very quarrelsome, destructive sorts of patterns who are left unchallenged because everybody else doesn't really understand that psychology. And so they assume, well, if you just kind of ignore this and maybe give more and more, just do what they want you to do, that will bring about some kind of unity, and it doesn't work.
That's interesting that you make the point about the normies, or sort of the broad middle, which we have talked about quite a bit on this show. And it's an interesting observation, Russell. So you're saying, in the particular cultural moment we're in, people who would be more moderate, people who would be, representative of perhaps the majority of people, tend to step back in a season like this. Can you explore that a little bit? Like, why does that happen?
Yeah, and I can see that happening every day in church after church after church. I can see it happening in the United States Congress and in all kinds of other institutions. what happens is you can have a very small group of people who can absolutely control the temperature of an organization because they're willing to do almost anything, or at least they're willing to do things that normal people would not be willing to do. And so you have the majority, often the vast majority of people who, because they're not given, for all kinds of good reasons, they're not given to fighting and craziness and all these things, they start to just step back and to disengage. And their whole, one of the things in our denomination, it took a lot of work to convince the healthiest people to be involved. You had to tell them this is why you need to be here. And because they didn't need to have some sort of a honorific title of having served on some board or some committee. They had lives and ministries that they were carrying out, which left often the people who really wanted to be there and who really wanted to be at a microphone at a meeting. And that's not that's just not a balanced way of going forward. And so a lot of times what happens for instance, take a local congregation. You've got a small group of people who maybe they're coming up against the pastor. And what they do is to start just one thing after the other coming in, and there's all kinds of the same tactics that are involved. Well, even if 90% of the people are perfectly happy with the pastor, what eventually starts to happen is those 90% start saying, wow, we're really exhausted by this. Why is the pastor always in controversy? And so what they're going to do is to eventually come to him, usually, and say, why don't you just kind of apologize or make this go away? Because the pastor can't really respond, because if he does, that small group of people will say, oh, look at the pastor being divisive. So you can't do that. And so it's a very, very difficult place to be. And you eventually end up then with those good people just getting worn down and they get exhausted. And that leads to, there's a really important book Brian Klaas wrote called Incorruptible. I think about it all the time, where he talks about his mom, who was a school board member. And she was a school board member because she cared about kids, she cared about education. It was mostly a really boring job for most people, going through curriculum, hiring policies, and so forth. And he said, if she had been in some of these school board situations that are kind of circuses of people screaming at each other, she just wouldn't have run because she's not the kind of person who likes that. The problem is, what do you end up with? You end up with the kind of people who like that. And often in institutions, what you end up with are either people who are willing to kind of play that game, or you have people who are able to so numb themselves and shut themselves down that they're able to survive what it takes to live in that context. And that is not healthy for anybody.
So I want to go back and unpack some of what you said to start this answer. And I want to go back to the heresy trial. But before we do that, you said something with all the institutions in decline. And I think that's true, right? Like Christianity is decline in America. Your former denomination is in decline. Almost every denomination is in decline. All the research shows that. What is it about decline that attracts? Like, what is the connection between the radicalization and tribalization that we've seen in American life and decline? Is there a link there? What is that link? Or is there another explanation for it?
Well, I think there are several things. A friend of mine, Yuval Levin's written a book called A Time to Build on institutions. And he talks about the cycle that's broken. So institutions are meant, when an institution does its job, it's shaping and forming people to lead the institution and to carry that forward. They have a character-forming job. When the institution doesn't do that and loses credibility and loses trust, ends up not shaping and forming the character of people, and then those are the people who have the institution. I mean, it's just it's a cycle that goes through. But I also think it's the case that when there is decline in an institution or there's crisis in an institution, often there becomes a panic. And you have, there was an elderly pastor who told me one time, and this has proven to be true in so many cases. He was talking about a group of churches in a city that he knew that always seemed to be fighting with each other. And I said, what's the deal? And he said, all of those churches are in decline and their people really don't kind of know it yet. And that whenever you have those institutions in decline, people start becoming really, really obsessed with policing their boundaries and who has what title and who has what position. And I've found that to be true.
It's interesting. Most of our listeners are American, but I live in Canada. I spend a lot of time in the U.S., have a green card, the whole deal, et cetera, et cetera. But, we in Canada probably became post-Christian 40 years ago, 50 years ago. It happened in the 60s, 70s, for sure. And I was alive as a kid in the 60s, have a memory going back to the 70s and definitely the 80s. We didn't go through a radicalization in the church as the church declined. It kind of became a cowering to the corner. This is going on. I guess we're a minority now, kind of thing. And there wasn't that. Now, in the last 5-10 years, we've had some echo of the radical politics in the U.S. Witness the Canadian truckers, et cetera, et cetera. But I would say, as a Canadian, not that I'm entitled to speak for our country, that was an echo of what was happening in the U.S. It was a direct reflection of what was happening with Donald Trump and the Republican Party and the Democrats on the left, et cetera, et cetera. But we didn't really have it. And you could argue in the 19th century, I know a little bit about European politics. Europe definitely was fractionalized and factionalized, and you had the rise of Nazism and fascism in the 1930s in Europe. But I don't know that was directly tied to the decline of the church. The church had been declining for a century in Europe. So I'm just wondering, is there anything uniquely American that has activated the tribalism that you see?
Well,
or maybe
yes.
maybe my reading of history is wrong. Feel free to correct.
Well, I think your reading of European history is a bit wrong because, if you think about the rise of fascism in the 1920s and 1930s, that did include a fear of, our Christian heritage as Germans or as Italians Austrians, that's under assault from some other. And so this is why you ended up with the captivity of the German Christians in the churches. And you see that for instance, right now in Russia, with the way that the Russian Orthodox Church has become an extension in some ways of the state. So that has happened in a European sense. But I think you're right that there's a unique relationship in American life with religion. And it's like anything else. There are strengths that have a shadow side, and that's the case. That's the case here. Why was religion, particularly evangelical Christian religion, able to proliferate so quickly in the United States, and then from there, missionary movements all over the world? Well, it's because you had Baptists and Methodists and some others who were highly entrepreneurial. They didn't have to go through a committee checklist to go out onto the frontier and preach and start a church and church plant. And so you had that highly entrepreneurial kind of model and a highly populist model that has a lot of strengths, but it ended up having some terrible drawbacks too when the shadow side emerges from that.
Let's go back to your trial. So it's quote heresy, close quotes, right? You being interrogated by a committee. And can you replay the incident or incidents that led up to that questioning?
Well, there were really three broad issues that led to a lot of these problems. One of them was the Trump phenomenon, and I, of course, was not on board with Donald Trump. Am not on board with Donald Trump, and had from really. Someone said the other day from 2015 on, and it really was from 2014 on, because Donald Trump had blasted Christian missionaries in 2014 when there was the talk of treating Ebola-infected missionaries, and he said something along the lines of they knew what they were getting into. They need to pay the consequences of it. So it had been going back a long way. That was a key part of it. There were also questions of race, and within our denomination, which of course was formed in advance of the Civil War in order to protect slaveholding. Mm-hmm. That it was a really, really incendiary point. And then the issue of sexual abuse, which also includes with it the question of women and the treatment of women and the place of women. And all of these things kind of converged in various ways, but those were the three central problems.
Well, you and Beth Moore, and by the way, we have a lot of Southern Baptist listeners. I work with Southern Baptist churches. We work with a broad coalition of people, all the way from charismatics through to conservative evangelicals, through to mainline, through to even some people who would consider themselves progressive. I want this to be a fairly large tent. I would share, I think, a lot of your convictions from what I know about you. So, I mean, I'm definitely on the conservative evangelical side, but I think we need to have a wide tent, particularly when you're a minority culture. So I'm not out to bash any denomination. Right, you left. Right. Beth Moore, who's been on this podcast, a friend of yours, left, and others. What went into your decision to step out of the Southern Baptist denomination?
One of the things that I often have to make clear is that's not a decision for anybody else. I mean, I think my closest friends are still SBC, and I think some of them initially thought, "Oh, are you going to think badly of me?" No, that's. I stayed for a long, long time. And so it was a situation for me where I said I couldn't in good conscience stay in the system that I was a part of. And some of that was because I was seeing a lot of people who were coming into Southern Baptist life. Either they were SBC, but they were kind of at the margins and they were coming in and getting involved, or people who were actually affiliating and coming in who didn't have the sort of, I mean, I've been in this culture 9 months before I was born on, and I've been in every committee room and where all the bodies are buried. Well, maybe not all of them, but a lot of them, and so I know the situation really well. And a lot of those people were coming in and getting really hurt by an institutional culture, not by most of the people who are in the pews, not by most of the pastors, but an institutional culture that was hurting them. And so it was almost as though I was bringing people into something, in some ways under false pretenses, in order to say, well, here's what the SBC is, because I was, my wife says I still am an SBC cheerleader. And, I really believed in our cooperative missions and so forth. So that was the case for me, but it's not the case for a lot of other people. And sometimes I'll say, this applies, I have this conversation all the time with people who are in all kinds of different denominations or church traditions or institutions, who will say, how do you know if you should leave or stay? And there's not an easy answer to that, because there's a kind of leaving that just says, okay, well, I'm going to go find a place of refuge somewhere else, and just leave. And a lot of times what happens then is you have people who, if they had pressed on, would have come through whatever that is. Mm-hmm. You also have a situation where there are a lot of people who stay in toxic systems and end up destroying themselves and others by doing that. And so you have to kind of know which situation you're in, and it's not always easy. And for me, what I found was I had to leave because I am too Southern Baptist, in the sense that this kind of response, I knew rationally what it was. I knew how to map all that out, but it felt like exile. My mind could differentiate between that sort of shenanigans and Jesus saying, "Depart from me, you worker of iniquity." But my limbic system really couldn't, or my heart really couldn't. And so I would find that was the situation I was in. And, it came to the point where I thought, I'm really not able to fix this, because in order to fix this system that we have, it can't just be fixed by saying, let's just kind of ignore this and wait till it passes. And so I didn't want to do what it would take to win, and most people, every year at the Southern Baptist Convention meeting, which was always one of the happiest times of the year, I would leave encouraged, affirmed, all the way through. But it was what happened between those meetings, and so I just realized I can't fix that, and that's why in my situation, my particular ministry, I loved every minute of it. I had the most amazing team. I had the most amazing and supportive board. It was not anything to do with my particular ministry or institution. It was that larger system. And I realized I don't have the power to really help with that. So it's time for me to do something else.
I left a denomination about a decade and a half ago and completely resonate with, hey, this size fits me. I'm not recommending anybody do anything. I think that's a really individual decision. Yeah. And I get asked about it all the time. And I'm like, well, those are my reasons. I don't know whether they're your reasons. And it's a soul-searching time for sure. Russell, what did you learn about yourself in leaving the denomination in the time since then?
Well, I think I learned just how entwined and embedded I am with my denominational tradition. In a way that I think it was almost necessary to free me from that for me. And I say am instead of was because, I have a Baptist hymnal right here next to me on the desk. And I that's just who I am. That's who I was shaped to be, and that's who I am. So I think I saw that, and I also saw though my reliance on a group of people who were distant enough in the sense that they were outside of my immediate context, so they didn't have a stake in me staying or leaving, but who knew me. And were able to give counsel and able to give wisdom, encouragement, and so forth. And I learned just how reliant I am on that. And I think also the sense that I think I see in my own life that when I see other people who are going through awful situations, a lot of times when it's clearly sort of ridiculous, I just assume, well, they know that. And I just sort of laugh it off and shrug it off and don't think, well, that person needs me to say, hey, I'm not only am I with you, but you haven't done anything wrong. And now I think I'm a lot more sensitive to that because for a while, I say for a while, it's still the case that one of the most stressful things in my life is getting a text message that says praying for you. Because
yeah, those are never good. They're always loaded, right?
My immediate response is, what's happened? So my closest friends now know that they have a preface to say, nothing's happening, nothing's going on. I just happen to be thinking about you today and praying for you and grateful for you. So I think I'm a lot more sensitive to that going on than I was before.
Any advice, and again, this is not a recommendation that people stay or leave at denominations, but any advice for those who are leaving or in the process of leaving or thinking of leaving about how to do it well?
Well, I think the one thing is to make sure that you're protecting yourself from bitterness or rage or anger. And we were talking about Tim Keller before we went on the air. One of the things that Tim said to me in the middle of some of this stuff was to say, now make sure that you watch your anger. And I said, I'm not angry at all. And I genuinely wasn't. And he said, yeah, that's what concerns me, because you can have a kind of anger that you don't think you should have that can then get redirected, and that's dangerous too. You've got to watch that. And I think he was right. And so I would say watch for anger and bitterness and what it does to you. And then also for people who have, and my problem wasn't bitterness. My problem was, and a lot of my closest friends said this, your temptation is to a kind of nostalgia that just sort of erases those things and looks back longingly, kind of Lot's wife sort of a situation. And that is completely accurate and has proven to be completely accurate all the time. And my wife, well, we saw there was somebody who had written about being an alcoholic, and that one of the things she had to do was to put a little note on her mirror that says, it really was that bad. Because she knew she would just sort of forget about all of those things and think, those times weren't that bad. And she'd find herself slipping back into it. And so I have to have people who are doing that. I mean, and some of that is because, there's a lot that I intentionally do not know and don't want to know. So I didn't read any articles at all about any of this ever. Still haven't. And I didn't want people to say, hey, you know what so-and-so said about you. I just didn't want to know that kind of stuff. It wasn't helpful to me at all. So that can lead you to a sort of, well, yeah, maybe everything was fine. And I just because of the way I was raised, that's the persistent problem. And I find myself kind of longingly looking backward, and my wife will say, "You're you're in Wonderland. That is not the way that things happen." So that would be, I would say, just know your own vulnerabilities there as to how to shore those things up beforehand and through. And then the other thing I would say is, especially if it's an institution or a tradition that you feel like you have to leave, and it's been really shaping on you, prepare for grief.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is grief that is genuinely, it's very similar to my dad died in 2020. And one of the things that I found was that when he initially died, I was kind of able to go into grief, and then I was able to get myself back together because I had to preach the funeral and write the obituary and do all of those things. And then later, there would be these sort of waves that would come and still do. And it's surprising to me that grief isn't just like a intense thing that then kind of goes down like on a graph until it evaporates away. That's not how it works. And it's a very similar situation with a beloved institution or tradition.
So you've written a new book, Losing Our Religion, and I want to start with the title, and I'm glad you went there. I remember when the song first came out from REM, I thought, wait, this isn't about losing your religion. It's about something else, and I didn't realize it was Southern expression. You talk about why you chose that title and the other meaning behind losing our religion. It's a beautiful pun or double entendre.
Yeah. People, whenever there's something, a news segment or something like that about people who are losing their faith and walking away from their faith, they would play that song, and it makes sense. And it even makes sense in terms of the life of Michael Stipe, the lead singer of REM, who is the grandson of Methodist. He comes from a line of Methodist ministers, and he's now some sort of a Zen Buddhist, I think, or something like that. Sure. So it makes sense. But what they said is that it's not about losing your religion that way. It's about the kind of anger that in the expression, I'm about to lose my religion, meaning I'm at that place where politeness is about to give its way over to anger. And what I have seen over the past several years is that those things often are not different things at all. That there are a lot of people who feel themselves to be losing their religion, and what they mean by that is not that they're kind of subtracting beliefs or those sorts of things. It's because they're looking at a kind of religion that they've been in and saying, what was this really all about? And that's happening a lot. It's as recently as this morning, conversations that I have with people. So that really was the impetus behind.
And is that happening to you? Is there a sense in which you were about to lose your religion? Like, what was this really all about?
No, not. And I think the reason for that is because I had already sort of worked through those kinds of things in a time of disillusionment as a teenager. So I'd kind of already gone through that crisis and really examined what what do I really believe, so that I was able to differentiate in a lot of ways Jesus from what happens in Jesus's name. And I had enough time with Christ and with my faith that I think maybe if I had been at an earlier time in my life, I probably would have. I mean, there were, in terms of, if you say losing your religion, there were all kinds of ways in which I said and would say, well, the particular religious project that I was involved in had a lot of horrifying elements to it. And I would, and I was talking to somebody who had this experience in a completely different context. There were things that you would look at and you would just have this seems crazy to me, but I seem to be the only one who thinks that, so it must just be me. And you just sort of put them out of your mind, and then you look backward and put them all together and think, why didn't you see all of this? And so that was more of the question, but not a question of whether to walk away from the faith.
Oh, that's fair. Yeah, and that was sort of what I was driving at, because the book is a bit of a missive or a letter, an epistle to the modern church, not just your former denomination, but to all of us who bear the name of Christ. Like, guys, wake up. And we got a lot of work to do. And I thought you had some really good points. I want to start with credibility. You tackle that in your work. And, I mean, look at the Barna data, look at the Pew data. Pastors used to be some of the most credible people in our community, and now we're not. We're not quite above used car salespeople and lawyers, but we're close. And what do you make about why we lost our credibility? Let's start there.
Well, I think what we would like to think is that, the outside culture is secularizing and hostile to Christianity, and that's the reason for this. So they're looking at our virtues and they despise them. We would like to say that. That's not what I think is happening for the most part. I mean, there's some of that, but I think for the far more dangerous thing is that you have people who are looking at us and saying, you don't really believe what you say you believe. And we have all kinds of evidence for that here. And so I sometimes I think there is a fearfulness of the outside secularizing world that can tip over into an anxiety and a panic and an anger. And with that, desperate times call for desperate measures that actually ends up secularizing. Because you end up with people whose own kids are then looking and saying, well, if that's what Christianity is, then that's not what I am. And when you have the outside world looking at this and saying, oh, so this is really just some sort of political or cultural sort of a thing. And the very thing that people think they're combating, they're actually fueling. And that leads to a really diminished sense of credibility. And you add to that, I mean, what we talked about earlier, this loss of institutional trust writ large, where people are asking, what institution can I trust? And not even necessarily can I trust in terms of morally, whether they can be evil, but what institution can I trust to actually be competent and mature? And you add that to the mix, and it's a very, very difficult situation.
Yeah, and at the heart of it, and you tackled this as well, is hypocrisy, right? Like when I read the scriptures, particularly the Gospels, and I kind of look at the religious leaders of the time and then the people Jesus really hung up with, I always feel like I'm right on the edge of being on the wrong side of that story, if not perhaps often on the wrong side of the story. And then I look at the church as a whole, judgmentalism, hypocrisy, some of the things you mentioned earlier, right? Just the condoning of abuse or covering things up, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, gosh, like it's so hard to find Jesus in the midst of this. What are your thoughts on hypocrisy and we'll talk about the life of the institutional church, because I think we've seen that perhaps elevate and move to new levels over the last, Kinnaman and Gabe Lyons, David Kinnaman and Gabe Lyons wrote about that in 2007 in the book Unchristian. And if anything, that's just amplified over the last 16 years. What are your thoughts on hypocrisy?
I really don't think hypocrisy is the problem.
Tell me
and
more.
I kind of wish it were. Because if you think about the classic cliche, hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue, which is to say, well, this is the way that we ought to behave with character and integrity, so let's pretend like we are. That's not what's happening right now. I mean, it is to some degree, but it always has.
It's worse than that.
It's a lot worse than that, which is a sense of there's such a lowered expectation that there is, in many cases, a valorizing of cruelty and power for the sake of power, and even sexual predation, and all of these other things, in a way that. One of the things that was most surprising to me in dealing with some of really awful abuses of power is the way that many people would respond with, grow up. This is the way people are, and so you have to play that game. Well, that is a really, really diminished sense of what humanity ought to be generally, but even more so of what the church ought to be.
So that's not hypocrisy. What is it? Calling evil good and good evil? Like what is that, Russell?
I called it, it's kind of, if you think about the prosperity gospel, which says if you believe, you'll flourish financially and in terms of your health. This is kind of a depravity gospel that says, well, yeah, you're awful, but so is everybody else, and that means that awfulness is the way to win. And that is what has sort of set in at every level. And the problem with it, there's a sense in which no one wants to be naive, and nobody wants to be seen that way. And so you find yourself in a mode where you think you're being realistic, and what you're really becoming is Machiavellian and social Darwinist in ways that are really, really destructive of the church's witness, of institutional life, and maybe more importantly, of your own conscience and your own soul, because you start to adjust. And that's one of the things that happens is we're always able to talk ourselves into saying, okay, well, here's why I'm living with whatever it is. You can look at white pastors in the Jim Crow South in the United States, including a lot of them who knew better when it came to the kind of racial injustice that was happening around them. And what were they doing? Most of them were saying, well, in order to really help bad things from happening, I have to have a place at the table. And in order to have a place at the table, I have to conserve my influence. And so that means I can't speak to this right now, which ultimately, there's never comes a point in which someone says, oh, now is the risk-free time for integrity. That doesn't happen. And so you just end up conserving it all the way through. And it does tremendous damage to the way that Jesus talks about the inner and the outer to line up. When that starts to be torn apart, it leads to all kinds of further destruction.
So what do you do? Because you're not alone. And I mean, you're an insider saying, yeah, there's corruption and there is sin, and it's not hypocrisy, it's intent, right? Like, I'm intending to wound, I'm intending to hurt. And you've seen that at some of the highest levels. And that kind of plays into the critics' worst fear, that that's really what the church is about. What do you do with that? Like, how do you call that out if you see that? What, like, I always want to believe it's not as bad as they say. I'm the optimist. Like, you got to find some good people out there. But yeah, there's some really bad actors at work across different traditions within the church. What do you do when you see it, Russell?
Well, I think the really dangerous thing that many people adopt is this idea, well, if you just don't talk about it and talk about all the good things that are going on, that will keep the church from being criticized by her enemies.
Right.
And you can just sort of ride things out. When in reality, what you end up doing in that case is completely destroying credibility, including on the inside with the generations that are to come who know what's going on.
Yeah.
And so because you haven't talked about it or addressed it, there are many people who would assume, okay, well, then maybe that's what it's all about. I talked about it in the book, I think, a lady who came up to me one time and said, my daughter's having a theological crisis. She went away to college, help me with her. And I said, okay, well, what is her crisis? And I was expecting it to be, she's fallen in with the wrong crowd, or she's taking existential philosophy and but it was, she's got a lot of non-believing, atheist, agnostic, other kinds of secularist friends, and they display peace, joy, love, gentleness, self-control, often in ways that she does not see in the church. Well, there's an ancient biblical and Christian answer to that. I mean, that shouldn't have been surprising. But if you say, well, if we just don't talk about those realities, then they will go away. That's just not the way Jesus responds to these things. And it's also the case that what we want to do and what's easy to do is to say, let's talk about what's happening out in the world, but not to talk about what's happening on the inside, which is the exact opposite of what the Apostle Paul says we are to do in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. And it's also that has a very light and trivial view of the church. So the golden calves that Jeroboam put up at Bethel were worse than the paganisms going on around the world. It was worse because it was using the name of God and using the place of where God had met with Jacob and met with his people at Bethel. It was worse. It was actually a blasphemy. And often what we have going on the inside is not just that we're doing the wrong thing, but we're doing the wrong thing and we're saying we're doing this because this is what Jesus is like. And that is, I mean, if you think about Jesus himself, he is saying ahead of time, I'm telling you all these things so you won't be alarmed. And then the first extended words that we have from Jesus after his ascension are really brutally honest words to the church. And why? Because the church is the body of Christ. Church is to be united to Christ. And so it's important. It's really important. If the church is just another, interest group or group of people, then yeah, I guess PR is good enough for you. But if the church is actually the demonstration plot of the kingdom of God, then it's quite another thing altogether.
Just a quick excursus. What is the biblical answer you would have given to that mother who was concerned about her daughter, whose friends, secular friends, were displaying more Christian virtues than her Christian friends were?
Well, the tension that we have in the scripture of createdness and fallenness. So that people are all people created in the image of God, all people who have conscience, and all people who then are going to display this. And also that you have fallenness that is universal. And I think one of the problems is a lot of times the way that we prepare, we think that we're preparing next generations of Christians is by giving them a really scary, caricatured view of people or ideologies that are on the outside, to the point that a lot of times when people actually then talk to those people, they start to realize, oh, wait, these aren't supervillains in a lair.
These are fantastic people.
These are fantastic people. And
totally.
Of course, because that's nobody or very few people sit down and say, let me find a way to be evil. That's not the way that people live. And so having that more complex view of human nature is what's actually preparing people.
So tribalism and nostalgia, those are two things that you have lots of thoughts on. Can you talk about what tribalization, you could call it the ideological bent or the political partisan bent, I should say, bent that a lot of church leaders are on, sometimes to the left, but a lot on the right. What are we losing when we do that?
Sometimes people will say, what about all of the politics? And I'll say we have almost no politics, because what politics actually is people who are working together in the civic space to get things done. That is not what we're seeing. What we're seeing are people who are finding ways to have belonging and to have meaning in partisan or culturally defined groups that is largely not defined by what the group loves together as who the group hates together or who the group's afraid of together. So I'm not that. And that's one of the reasons why you can even see the way that people can completely change ideologies if their partisan tribe and group changes those ideologies. And I mean, pollster after pollster has demonstrated you can do this. You can call the same person and say, do you agree with Barack Obama that, and give a statement, and then wait a few minutes and say, do you agree with Donald Trump that? And you will have yes and no, even though it's the exact same issue, because it's about who am I and where do I belong? And that ultimately leads to exhaustion, and that's where we are. That's where we are right now. And it's also not the way of Jesus, who, if you look at what's happening in the Gospels, a lot of it is about, wait, which of our groups are you in? And he just walks right through that.
It's like none of the above.
None of the above, yeah. Calling both a zealot and a tax collector to be disciples.
Yeah.
I mean, that it's an entirely different way of being. And I think one of the things that's happened is, we talk about sort of post-Christian world and secularized world. What we don't realize is how we have secularized. And I mean, sometimes even the loudest religious people, and sometimes I mean even especially the loudest religious people, because as one person said, the thinner the identity, the louder, because you have to somehow prove that you're this, and so
True.
you can have this sort of secularizing of spiritual warfare language that is the opposite of what the New Testament teaches, not against flesh and blood. But when you demonize people, I mean, you think about what that language, our language and our metaphors, they shape us. And one of the things that demons are not redeemable. Demons are wholly evil and irredeemable. Once we start having that attitude toward people to whom we're to bear witness and demonstrate the reality of Christ, we're not doing what Jesus told us to do.
The other big thing we're seeing intensify in our day is what you talk about as nostalgia, right? This idea that if we could only get back to the Reagan era, or the Eisenhower era, if we could only take over the Supreme Court and get it back to what it was before, the governorship or whatever, make our schools the way we want them to. Talk about the power of nostalgia. What's at stake and why it has such a grip on so many conservative evangelicals right now?
Well, a lot of this sort of nostalgia is a really low view of human fallenness and a really low view of the power of the Holy Spirit. Because what we do is we imagine, and all of us do this. I mean, we do this in our own lives. We look backward. I found myself doing that. I wrote that chapter. And then just maybe 2 weeks ago, I was in this very room with my wife. Something came up about the 1990s. And I said, oh, weren't the 90s great? Oh, wish we... and I
the music was great.
Yeah. A lot of things were. But you know, the reason that the 1990s are so great and idyllic in my mind is that I know how they end. So you're not in the middle of it. When you're in the middle of it, you're wondering what's going on. Where's the future? You can look back without all of those worries and stresses and only see the good things. And we can do that societally as well. And so a lot of times you will have people saying the problem is the way that this culture has fallen apart. We need to get back to the way that it was. And the culture fell apart somewhere between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, right. Long before we had any understanding. And in every era then, you have human sin and fallenness. It manifests itself sometimes in kind of an outright paganism and sometimes as kind of a self-righteous Christianity. It can manifest itself in any way, but it's fallenness. And in every era, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And if we don't remember that, then we're going to be looking backward and saying, well, let's get back to there. Rather than saying, okay, Jesus is raised from the dead, seated at the right hand of the Father. I'm united to him by the Holy Spirit, which means his future is my future. His past is my past, his future is my future. That ought to liberate us from the kind of, especially the kind of nostalgia that becomes weaponized. It's not just sort of it was great then. It becomes, who took this away from me? And that can then put us into this sort of perpetual outrage cycle. And we want to know who are the people who did this so that we can find some kind of retribution for them. And that's just not the way of Christ.
So what's the way out, forward, ahead? I mean, it can be a very despairing thing, right? Cynicism is not that difficult to find now in this moment. So what's the way forward, Russell?
Well, I think the way forward is, I think there are a lot of people who think, I quoted in the book Wendell Berry, who said to a group of environmental activists one time, You think that the solutions have to be as big as the problems. when most problems are resolved by many small-scale solutions. And so there's not a lot that any one person or any one church can do about the big picture of what's happening in the world, what's happening in religion, those sorts of things. What you can do is to recognize that and be renewed in your mind, which is to say, okay, I see that I'm going to ground myself in the word, in prayer. I'm going to recognize and look for these signs of life that are around me. I'm not going to panic. I'm going to trust that Jesus actually is going to keep his promises. And I'm also going to make sure that I don't overreact to the last bad thing, which is often what we do is to say, okay, well, this was bad, so whatever's the complete opposite of that is the answer. No, I'm going to be grounded in cultivating a conscience that is informed by the Holy Spirit and by the Word. And what you will often find is sometimes you'll feel like you're by yourself in that. And then you start to see, oh, wait, God actually is at work all over the place. And now these people are finding each other. And that's what I see happening right now. And you look at that, it's happening all over the world. So Christianity, whatever happens in the American church, Christianity's doing fine.
Yeah, that's true. It's much bigger. So I got to ask you, with everything you've seen, with everything you've experienced, with everything that's been thrown at you, how have you not become an ex-evangelical? How have you not just thrown up your hands? I mean, you've taken on new leadership responsibilities, et cetera, et cetera. Why did you not just go, it's too hard. I'm going to read my Bible, live out my days, or just like given up and thrown the baby out with the bathwater?
Well, I think because, I really believe Jesus is alive. I mean, I really believe, as one person put it, the Easter women weren't lying.
Yeah.
I really believe that. And then you add to it, I mean, I noticed myself getting a little cynical at one point, and I snapped out of it because I was standing over my son Jonah, baptizing him at our congregation. And as I was doing that, the words just came to me, I will give you no sign except for the sign of Jonah. The Son of Man is alive, and the Ninevites repented when they heard that word. I mean, that's the sign of Jonah is all around us. And I just stopped and said, how in the world can I be cynical when I'm looking down at this miracle? And how can I not respond to that with awe and gratitude? A lot of times that's hard to do. And what I would say to somebody is not, don't get cynical, don't get bitter. I would just say, just notice and say, God, I think I'm getting cynical and I don't know what to do about that.
Right.
That breaks the power of it. It's not, make sure that you do all of these things to get out of it. Just the recognition, I'm powerless in front of this, but I'm crying out and expressing that to God. That's what's important.
You also signed up to be editor-in-chief of Christianity Today, which used to be a fairly neutral thing, but it's not anymore. It's too been weaponized and polarized, and people would think that's a good thing or a bad thing. Why did you decide in yet another form to put yourselves back in the front line of leadership?
Because I really do believe in this mission, and because I think that there is a church that is in need of equipping, and also a church that is whose gospel is in need of proclaiming. And so I just don't think I don't think we have the privilege to get exhausted and give up.
What question have I not asked you, or have other people not asked you that you think needs to be asked?
Oh, I don't know. I can't think. I was actually thinking about that the other day because I was rereading Walker Percy's Questions That They Never Asked Me. So he did an interview with himself. and one of them is, how can you stay? He was Catholic. How can you stay in the Catholic Church given all of the disasters? And he said, well, it's a sign of its supernatural origin that it's been able to survive all of this fraud and deceit and incompetence. And so, I get it. But I can't think of anything that no one's asked me. Really.
And nothing that you're chomping at the bit to talk about that no one's given you the opportunity to?
I don't think so. I think I've kind of laid it out there, yeah.
That's great. Well, the book is called Losing Our Religion. And where can people, I mean, obviously at Christianity Today, but where else can people find you online these days? Where are you active?
Well, my Twitter account is at Dr. Moore, Dr. Moore, but I'm finding myself spending a lot more time on Threads these days.
Oh, cool.
And I really, for whatever reason, I really like it so far, and I hope that keeps up.
So that's you over on Threads, and it's so funny because Twitter is now X, of course, but everybody who writes about it has to say formerly known as Twitter. It's becoming the Prince of social media, the artist formerly known as Prince, right? Yeah. Thank you, Elon. Russell, this has been a delight. Thank you. This is long overdue. I'm so glad to finally have you on my podcast, and particularly in this moment where I think we need a voice somewhere from the middle, from the normal, and I really appreciate what you shared today.
Well, thanks for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.